Hello, my dear listeners. Tonight, I invite you to those dark and hopeful nights of June 1815. Slowly close your eyes. Let yourself go. Imagine you're being drifting onto that muddy ground, among the wet grass, beside a soldier. Soon, you will bear witness to the moments when Emperor Napoleon's last hope blossomed and then withered. Right by his side, like a kneeling foot soldier, experiencing every breath, every whisper, every scent of the earth. The calendar showed March 1st, 1815. I remember that news with a slight shiver. News carried by the wind from the tiny island of Elba, disturbing Europe's sleep. He had returned. Napoleon Bonaparte. At that moment, I felt the sheer weight of that name in my bones. He was advancing towards Paris. Every step he took carried rekindled loyalties and reignited hopes. Kings, emperors, all of them were having sleepless nights once more. For us, this meant the end of weariness. Perhaps ... we would march to victory again. I felt that jubilant crowd, just as you now feel the spirit of this text. Everyone's eyes held that same sparkle, hope. His entry into Paris on March 20th, 1815. It was like a triumphal procession. As we passed through the dusty roads and entered the city, you could hear the shouts. Long live the Emperor! The enthusiasm of the people carried him to the Tuileries Palace. It was as if he had never left. The cold face of the Bourbons had given way to the warm dream of an empire once more. But this was a short-lived dream. The 100 days had begun. It was as if the brilliance of that palace dazzled your eyes, yet there was an underlying unease. How long could such a quickly won victory last? The uncertainty in the air was felt with every breath. The great powers of Europe saw Napoleon's sudden return as a massive threat to peace. They hadn't yet shaken off the weariness of long years of war. Never again. They would never give Napoleon this chance again. On March 25th, the Seventh Coalition was formed. The United Kingdom, Prussia, Russia, Austria. Everyone was united against Napoleon. 5 separate armies were to be assembled. 2 were to be sent to Belgium, a 105,000-man Anglo-Dutch-German army under Wellington, and a 120,000-man Prussian force under Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. The others were further away, positioned along the Rhine River, but it would take time for them to reach full strength. This was our chance, the Emperor's chance. The distant cannon sounds we heard at night were harbingers of the coming storm. It was precisely this delay that was the Emperor's hope. Before the other coalition armies could fully materialize, he had to crush Wellington and Blücher separately. This was his last chance. Secretly, silently, his army, the Army of the North, was massing on the Belgian frontier. From Paris, Lille, Metz, thousands of soldiers were answering their emperor's last call. 89,000 infantry, 22,000 cavalry, 11,000 artillerymen. They advanced rapidly. All were towards victory, or so we believed. We felt the ground trembling beneath our feet. That long journey under the stars felt endless. On June 15th, the army crossed the frontier at Charleroi. The fateful moments had begun. When we lay down at night, we saw the campfires on the Prussian side. They were coming too. The Allies were not completely unprepared. Several Prussian scouts had already noticed the large concentration of campfires across the French border. Suspicious, Blücher had concentrated his army at Ligny, but Wellington, he was less prepared. He had expected Napoleon to advance along the road from Mons to Brussels. But advancing through Charleroi meant moving directly between the 2 Allied armies. Wellington learned of this reality on the morning of June 16th at the Duchess of Richmond's ball. We heard that he supposedly whispered, "Napoleon has humbugged me, by God." At that moment, a smile spread across our faces. It felt as if we had already won. The first taste of victory lingered on our lips. Napoleon had to keep the two coalition armies separated. That's why he split his army into three parts. Marshal Michel Ney's left wing was to seize the vital crossroads at Quatre Bras. For us, this meant our chances were high. Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy's right wing and Napoleon's own reserve forces were to attack the Prussian army at Ligny. On June 16th, Ney arrived at Quatre Bras. It was lightly defended by 8,000 Dutch troops under Prince Orange. At 2 p.m., after the roar of 14 cannons began, Ney ordered an assault. Those cannon sounds, each one was a tremor in our hearts. Explosions, echoes. The Dutch stubbornly resisted from strong defensive positions. Wellington quickly poured reinforcements into the fray. By late afternoon, Wellington had 36,000 troops at Quatre Bras. He had taken personal command. An Allied counterattack at 6 p.m. pushed Ney back and recaptured most of the lost ground. The Battle of Quatre Bras ended in a draw, both sides having lost around 4,000 men. This wasn't a victory, but we had struck a blow. However, the concurrent events at Ligny were more intense. Seeing a chance to eliminate the Prussian army, Napoleon launched wave after wave of bloody assaults. Despite being outnumbered, the French managed to break the Prussian line by late afternoon. But in that roaring evening, something went wrong. A series of miscommunications prevented the French from effectively harassing the Prussian retreat and crushing their army. Although Blücher himself was wounded, and the Prussians lost over 17,000 casualties compared to 11,000 French losses, they were able to make an orderly retreat to waver. Napoleon ended June 16th in a good position. He had badly mauled the Prussian army, and Ney had cornered Wellington's force at Quatre Bras. All that remained was to finish what he had started the next day. We had seen the Emperor's tired yet hopeful expression. The scent of victory lingered in our nostrils, but beneath that scent, there was also the bitter taste of weariness and apprehension. That morning, June 17th, it felt as if even the air was heavy. Napoleon was in an uncharacteristic state of lethargy. He woke up late, and we waited. The precious morning hours were spent conducting troop inspections and touring the Ligny battlefield. The Emperor's usual vigor was gone. His weary lines were more pronounced. He only acted at 11:30 a.m. Marshal Grouchy, and 33,000 men were sent in pursuit of the Prussians. The Emperor himself would link with Ney at Quatre Bras to deliver the killing blow to Wellington's army. At that moment, a strange feeling. An inner voice whispered, "Why so slow?" Every passing minute increased the pressure on us. Napoleon's lethargy. Everyone was whispering about it. Some spoke of an illness, hemorrhoids, or a bladder infection. Others simply thought his prime was over. In 1815, Napoleon was almost 46 and overweight. Perhaps the unending energy on which he had built his career had run out. When you looked into his eyes, you could see that the old sparkle had been replaced by a weary shadow. The weight of that gaze, that anxious anticipation, it all descended upon us. Anyway, he didn't link with Ney at Quatre Bras until around 1 p.m. As we advanced, we learned that Wellington had pulled back. He had learned of Blücher's defeat at Ligny and had pulled back to the ridge at Mont Saint-Jean, a few miles away from his headquarters at Waterloo. After receiving confirmation from Blücher that at least one Prussian corps would be able to aid him in the event of a battle, Wellington decided to hold this position. The ground beneath our feet grew heavier, sinking into the mud with every step. As we pursued, the sky seemed to split open. A sudden thunderstorm broke out. We couldn't see anything. The muddy ground made it impossible for the French to pass through the countryside, and we were confined to using the roads, which took considerably more time. Our legs sank into the mud with every step. We heard that squelching sound from our boots. By the time the French arrived opposite Wellington's army, darkness had fallen. The decisive battle would have to wait until the morning. We spent that night wet and cold, with the uncertainty of the next day. Every raindrop, falling on the tent, increased our anxiety. We were cold, we were tired, but our hope was not extinguished. At the dawn of June 18th, 1815, the rain had stopped. The cold air filled our lungs. Only a valley of rain-soaked ground separated the French and Allied armies. We could smell that peculiar, bitter scent rising from the mud. Compared to other Napoleonic battlefields, the field of Waterloo was quite small. It was like a giant stage, but very narrow. The battle zone consisted of only 4.5 kilometers, 5,000 yards, stretching from the farmhouse of Hougoumont in the west to the village of Papelotte in the east. The French army, positioned on a ridge around the hamlet of La Belle Alliance, was 71,947 men strong. Most likely the best army Napoleon had commanded since the destruction of the Grande Armée in 1812. At that moment, I looked at the faces of the soldiers around me. Most were veterans, tired but determined. But next to me, there were also soldiers who had previously sworn allegiance to the Bourbons and now joined us. They weren't fully trusted. We heard whispers. Can the Emperor win with this army? What if there's betrayal? As one historian put it, Napoleon had never before handled an instrument of war that was at once so formidable and so fragile. We felt that fragility to our bones. Wellington's army was still drawn up on the Mont Saint-Jean ridge. We could see them, arrayed in a wedge shape. The majority of Wellington's troops were deployed on his right flank, while his left, east of the Brussels road, was lightly held. This was because Wellington was counting on the arrival of the Prussians to reinforce this flank. To slow the French advance, Wellington posted outlying troops at the forward positions of Papelotte, Fouchermont, and La Haye-Saint. His army was truly a multinational one. British, Dutch, German, soldiers from every nation gathered under Wellington's banner. Most of the British soldiers were veterans of the Peninsular War, 1807 to 1814, and had served under Wellington before. Whether Wellington would prevail depended on whether the Prussians could evade Grouchy at Wavre and march to Waterloo in time. We smelled the sharp scent of that morning, heard the quiet whispers of the soldiers, the coldness of the metal. Everyone's breath was caught in their throats, for we knew this would be either the end or the beginning of everything. Early in the morning, Napoleon held a breakfast conference with his senior officers at his headquarters in Les Cailloux. It reached us through whispers. They were talking about a report from Napoleon's brother, Prince Jerome Bonaparte. It seemed from a conversation between two British officers that Blucher planned to come to Wellington's aid, but the Emperor shrugged. Gossip, he had said. He had even disregarded warnings from his officers not to underestimate Wellington, whom he had never personally faced in battle before. He had called the Duke a bad general, the English soldiers bad troops. And that unforgettable sentence, "This affair is nothing more serious than eating one's breakfast." A condescending smile spread across his face. At that moment, a seed of doubt had been planted deep within me. Was the Emperor, perhaps, wrong this time? The battle began a little after 11 a.m., with the artillery of French General Reille's the Second Corps bombarding the Allied line. The first cannonballs pierced the wet ground with a dull, roaring sound. This was to be accompanied by an attack on the Allied position at the Hougoumont farmhouse, carried out by Prince Jerome's division. This was only supposed to be a diversionary assault. But the Hanover and Nassau troops defending Hougoumont proved more stubborn than expected. By 12:30 p.m., this diversion had turned into a bloody struggle that would last the rest of the day and would keep Reille's corps pinned down. Although Wellington sent in reinforcements, the struggle there did not greatly affect his own overall disposition. The cannon sounds sharpened. The rhythmic rumble of rifle fire had begun. Meanwhile, Napoleon unleashed an 84-gun bombardment on the Allied line. Most of the cannonballs couldn't get past the ridge behind Wellington's troops. The soft ground caused them to embed deep. At 1:30 p.m., Napoleon sent forward the first corps under Count Durlin to ascend the ridge and break the Allied line. Durlin's troops advanced in several lines, 250 men wide. This was an awkward formation, both unwieldy and vulnerable. As we moved through chest-high rye fields, rifle shots exploded around us, each bullet seemingly aimed at us. Despite heavy losses, Durlin's battered divisions inched stubbornly towards the Allied positions. One French division engaged a battalion of the King's German Legion at La Haye-Sainte, near the center of the Allied line, while additional French divisions captured Fischermont and Papelotte. Before long, Durlin's men had nearly crested the ridge. Your heart pounded in your chest, every explosion echoing in your mind. You heard the ringing cries and groans in your ears. At this point, Sir Thomas Picton's 4,000 British troops rushed forward to halt Durlin's assault. A moment of pause. Although Picton himself was killed, the British succeeded in pinning down Durlin's men. And then, Wellington's second-in-command, the Earl of Uxbridge, ordered forth 2 brigades of heavy cavalry that had been hiding behind the ridge. The thundering hooves of thousands of horses mingled with the trembling ground, as if the earth was splitting open. The clanging of swords, the neighing of horses, each was a distinct cry. Among them were the Scots Greys, who charged into action with shouts of "Scotland forever." We saw the cavalry coming towards us like the wind. This surprised the French troops. We quickly scrambled to form a square. We prepared our bayonets. Despite fierce resistance, Durlin's entire corps was soon fleeing back down the ridge. You could vividly imagine the fearless advance of that cavalry, the lightning flash of their swords. We were drenched in sweat and blood, but we could breathe. At around 1:30 p.m., a new threat emerged on our right flank. 3 Prussian corps were approaching. Blucher had managed to give Grouchy the slip by leaving 1 corps behind to pin him down at the concurrent Battle of Waver, freeing up over 48,000 Prussians to march to Wellington's aid. Napoleon decided to keep focusing on the Anglo-Allied army, hoping that Wellington would be crushed before the Prussians came close enough to intervene. But after the failure of Durlin's charge, Napoleon was forced to divert additional units to his right flank to meet the Prussians. By 4 p.m., 7,000 French were holding back 30,000 Prussians between Fischermont and Plancenoit. We felt the presence of the Prussians, their footsteps becoming clearer with every moment. You heard the sound of their drums carried by the wind, the rhythm of their march in your ears. A cold shiver ran down your spine. With the situation growing dire, the Emperor Napoleon knew he had to break Wellington before more Prussians could arrive. At 3:30 p.m., he ordered Ney to capture La Haye-Sainte, near the Allied center, at all costs. But Ney, who believed he had spotted a weakness in Wellington's center-right line, decided it would be better to launch a massive cavalry charge. The thundering hooves of thousands of horses mingled with the trembling ground, as if the earth was splitting open. The clanging of swords, the neighing of horses, each was a distinct cry. The French cavalry thundered towards the Anglo-Allied line, but was slowed by the sodden ground. This gave the Allies sufficient time to form squares. Wellington positioned field guns in between each square. Ney's charge broke upon the wall of British bayonets, as French horsemen were blown to bits by the field guns. You heard the whizzing of cannonballs, the wind you felt on your flesh, the groans of falling horses beside you. Several more French cavalry charges were attempted, but to no avail. Finally, Uxbridge's cavalry sallied forth to chase off the remaining French horsemen. You felt the terror of those cavalry charges, the deafening roar of the cannon fire. Amidst all these sounds, you felt lost. At 6 p.m., Napoleon reiterated his orders to Ney to capture La Haye-Sainte. This time, Ney led a coordinated attack that succeeded in capturing the farmhouse. The marshal wasted no time setting up a battery only 275 meters, 300 yards from Wellington Center, from whence he unleashed deadly fire onto the Allied line. This was the pivotal moment. Wellington's center was close to breaking, while the Prussians were still being detained by the French at Plancenoit. Napoleon knew that this was the time to break through the Allied center, but the only fresh French units were 14 battalions of the dreaded Imperial Guard. At 7 p.m., Napoleon ordered them forward. Visualize the majestic march of the Imperial Guard, the rhythmic rumble of their steps, the absolute determination on their faces. At that moment, you felt the tense anticipation hanging in the air, the weight of the Emperor's final decision. That last spark of hope burning within you. You felt this spark trembling in the midst of a storm. The Imperial Guard, close to 4,000 strong, marched forward with great fanfare. It was as if the earth trembled with their steps. Amidst the chaos of the battlefield, the charge eventually split into 2 separate columns, likely by mistake, allowing Wellington to focus on each in turn. Allied cannons and musket fire tore the Imperial Guard to pieces as it advanced up the ridge. You heard the whizzing of cannonballs, the clanging of bayonets, the cry of the soldier beside you, the sound of bodies falling next to you. When the charge lost momentum, Wellington ordered a general charge with fixed bayonets. You heard thousands of bayonets moving simultaneously, that metallic sound. And then, that sound, a cry went up that had not been heard on a Napoleonic battlefield for 15 years. La garde recule. The guard is retreating. This cry was not just a sound. It was the sound of an empire collapsing. French morale disintegrated as the soldiers fled, cries of treason and every man for himself filling the air. At the same time, the Prussians finally broke through the French defenses at Plancenoit. You saw the Imperial Guard fall apart before your eyes, the collapse of that supposedly invincible force. You felt the sound of that desperation ringing in your ears, the storm raging within you. The battle was over. Napoleon's empire was doomed. It had been a bloody affair, resulting in between 25 to 33,000 French casualties and 24,000 Allied losses. You could feel the bodies strewn on the muddy ground, the sharp scent of blood, the mournful silence hanging in the air. 4 days after the battle, Napoleon abdicated for a final time and was sent into permanent exile on St. Helena, where he would die in 1821. Waterloo marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars and ushered in a new balance of power, the concert of Europe that would last for the next several decades. And so, Napoleon's last dance ended on the muddy fields of Waterloo. An era closed, a new era began. Tonight, you visualized those moments. You felt the weight, the hopes, and the last breath of that era. The scent of those lands, those sounds, those feelings. Now, slowly let yourself go. Let the whispers of history envelop you. Sweet dreams.